The cold hum of the airport filled the air, punctuated by the metallic rolling of suitcases and the muffled overhead announcements. At Miami International Airport, the travelers moving briskly toward their gates had no idea they were about to witness the dramatic downfall of a woman whose family name had been whispered in the corridors of law offices and courtrooms for nearly a decade. 73-year-old Donna Adelson, elegant but visibly strained, clutched her passport and boarding pass. She was preparing to board a flight that investigators believed would take her far away, possibly out of reach of U.S. authorities forever. But before she could step through the gate, federal agents surrounded her. Her face froze. In that moment, she wasn't just a mother or grandmother. She was a suspect in one of the most chilling family-driven crimes in Florida's history, the murder-for-hire killing of Florida State University law professor Dan Markel. Just days earlier, her son, Charlie Adelson, had been convicted and sentenced to life in prison for orchestrating the murder. Now, investigators were certain Donna's role could no longer be ignored. The sight of her being handcuffed in public, the woman who once carefully projected the image of successful, close-knit mother and grandmother, stunned those who knew her. But for the Markel family, who had lived for 9 years with grief and relentless pursuit of justice, it was a moment they had been waiting for. The alleged mastermind was no longer untouchable. Before we begin, I want to thank my amazing viewers and subscribers for your support through your likes, shares, and comments. Your engagement helps make these stories more meaningful. If you're new here, be sure to hit that subscribe button and join our growing community of true crime enthusiasts. Before we unravel the web of conspiracy, bitterness, and betrayal that led to Donna Adelson's arrest, we need to step back and understand who the true victim of this case was. Dan Markel. Born on October 9, 1972, in Toronto, Canada, Dan Markel grew up in a warm, middle-class Jewish household. His parents, Phil and Ruth Markel, instilled in him a strong sense of community, intellectual curiosity, and Jewish identity. Friends and family remember Dan as a boy who carried an infectious smile and a quick wit. He was the kind of child who asked endless questions, not just what, but why and how. This natural curiosity carried into his education. Dan attended Harvard College, where his brilliance quickly stood out. He wasn't just another bright student. He was a thinker, deeply invested in the complexities of law, philosophy, and morality. His peers often described him as both driven and kind, a combination that made him a magnetic presence in academic circles. After graduating from Harvard, he earned his law degree at Harvard Law School and then clerked for judges and worked for a prestigious Washington, D.C. law firm. But what set Dan apart was his deep belief that law was more than statutes and regulations. To him, it was about people, justice, and the moral threads that bind society together. This belief eventually led him to academia. Dan became a professor at Florida State University College of Law, where he specialized in criminal law. His scholarly work was respected nationally, but more importantly, he became known as a passionate teacher who challenged his students to think critically. He authored numerous legal articles and co-authored a book, Privilege or Punish? Criminal Justice and Challenge of Family Ties, exploring the tension between personal relationships and criminal accountability, a tragic foreshadowing of his own fate. Outside the classroom, Dan was a devoted father to his 2 young sons, Benjamin and Lincoln. Colleagues recall how his eyes lit up whenever he spoke about them. Despite his demanding academic career, he made sure to attend school events, read bedtime stories, and build traditions with his boys. For Dan, fatherhood wasn't a role, it was his proudest identity. But beneath the surface of his accomplished and vibrant life, storms were gathering. His marriage to Wendi Adelson, a fellow lawyer, began unraveling. Their relationship, once full of ambition and shared dreams, deteriorated into tension and mistrust. And at the center of their disputes were their children. Dan met Wendi Adelson when both were carving out careers in the legal world. Wendi, the daughter of Donna and Harvey Adelson, came from a prominent South Florida family. While Dan was more academic and reflective, Wendi had a vibrant, ambitious energy. Together, they seemed like a promising power couple, 2 legal minds building a future. They married in 2006 and soon had 2 sons. At first, their marriage appeared solid, but by 2012, cracks began to show. Friends of the couple described mounting differences in lifestyle, priorities, and personalities. Wendi, supported closely by her mother Donna, wanted to relocate from Tallahassee back to South Florida to be closer to her family. Dan, deeply rooted in his career at Florida State, refused. This disagreement, seemingly about geography, soon ballooned into much more: custody battles, resentment, and a sense that Dan was standing in the way of the Adelson family's vision for Wendi and the children. In 2013, Wendi filed for divorce. The proceedings quickly grew contentious. While Dan wanted co-parent and remain close to his sons, the Adelsons, particularly Donna, reportedly wanted Wendi free from Tallahassee and free from Dan's influence. The custody disputes were emotionally draining. Court records show a bitter tug-of-war, with accusations and counter-accusations. Dan wanted stability and consistency for boys. Wendi and her parents wanted them raised in South Florida. For Dan, the court's decision granting joint custody was both a victory and a burden. It gave him the chance to remain a present father, but also meant the conflict with the Adelsons would not end. This is where Donna Adelson's presence becomes critical. Donna wasn't just a supportive mother watching from the sidelines. She was deeply involved, offering advice, financial support, and according to investigators, pushing Wendi toward more aggressive action against Dan. Emails later revealed her frustrations. She saw Dan as controlling, rigid, and an obstacle to her daughter's happiness. In one message, Donna expressed disdain over the custody situation, lamenting the impact it had on Wendi's life, and even joking bitterly about solving the problem. To outsiders, Donna Adelson was a successful dentist's wife, a caring mother and grandmother, active in her community. But to investigators who would later piece together the puzzle, she was a woman whose protective instincts for her daughter may have crossed into dangerous territory. Through all this turmoil, Dan Markel continued to thrive professionally. His scholarship was cited by courts across the country. He mentored students, published groundbreaking research, and was invited to conferences worldwide. Yet colleagues noticed the toll the custody battle was taking. His once boundless energy sometimes gave way to visible fatigue. Still, Dan pressed on, determined not to let the conflict overshadow his role as a father. In his last year of life, Dan remained hopeful that the disputes would settle and that he could provide stability for his children. But forces beyond his control were already moving against him, forces that would culminate in tragedy. What do you think so far about the role of extended family in custody disputes? Should parents' families, like in-laws or grandparents, have strong influence in decisions, or does it complicate matters? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. This was the world of Dan Markel before the crime, a brilliant scholar, a loving father, but also a man caught in a web of family tension that was growing more volatile by the day. In the months following Dan and Wendi's divorce, the hostility between the Markel and Adelson families didn't subside. It deepened. To neighbors and acquaintances, Wendi's life looked intact. She was back in Tallahassee with her sons, working, rebuilding. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. At the center of it was Donna Adelson. Friends later testified that she was consumed with anger over her daughter's situation. Donna felt that Dan's refusal to let Wendi relocate the children to South Florida was a cruel act, a decision that chained Wendi to a city she no longer wanted to live in. Her frustration seeped into conversations, emails, and even jokes that, in hindsight, no longer seemed like jokes at all. Donna sometimes expressed sentiments like, "It would be easier if Dan wasn't around," words that today read like grim foreshadowing. But what began as anger didn't stay contained. It grew into obsession. In family court, relocation is one of the most sensitive and contested issues. Florida law makes it extremely difficult for one parent to move children more than 50 miles away without the other parent's consent. Judges typically weigh the children's best interests, the existing parenting plan, and each parent's relationship with the children. Dan Markel's position was clear. He wasn't going to let his sons be moved hundreds of miles away. He wanted to remain an active father, involved in their daily lives. For Donna Adelson, this wasn't just inconvenient. It was intolerable. She believed Wendi deserved to return to South Florida, surrounded by family, financial stability, and opportunity. To her, Dan's refusal wasn't just stubbornness. It was a form of punishment. and she made that opinion very clear. Investigators would later discover that Donna Adelson was deeply entangled in her adult children's lives financially. The Adelsons weren't simply offering emotional support. They funded homes, cars, and lifestyles. Charlie Adelson, her son, worked as a periodontist in South Florida, but even he relied heavily on the family's wealth. That financial dependence also came with expectation, family loyalty. So when Donna expressed outrage at Dan, it wasn't only her anger speaking. It was a sentiment echoed and reinforced within the family circle. Together, the Adelsons began to see Dan not just as Wendi's ex-husband, but as an enemy, a barrier that had to be removed. Charlie Adelson, a charismatic but often reckless man, became the key player, unlike his sister Wendi, who maintained at least a surface of civility with Dan. Charlie's dislike of Dan was open and hostile. He mocked him, insulted him, and often complained to friends about the situation. Prosecutors would later argue that Charlie Adelson became the bridge between the family's frustrations and the actual killers who carried out the crime. At the time, Charlie was romantically involved with Catherine Magbanua, a woman who would play a central role in this deadly plot. Catherine was connected to two men with violent pasts: Sigfredo Garcia, her ex-boyfriend and father of her children, and his associate, Luis Rivera, a known gang member. This trio would form the lethal chain of execution, all allegedly linked back to the Adelsons through Charlie. In hindsight, there were conversations that should have set off alarm bells. Wiretaps later revealed that Donna and Charlie made disturbing comments, couched in casual tones but carrying sinister weight. One particularly chilling exchange involved Charlie joking about buying Wendi a television as a divorce present, but clarified that what she really deserved was a hitman. To anyone else, it might have sounded like a dark joke. To investigators years later, it was a breadcrumb, evidence of intent. Donna herself expressed similar sentiments, suggesting at times that solving the problem would free Wendi's life. At the time, none of this reached law enforcement. These were private conversations, hidden in text messages, phone calls, and family chatter. But they reveal a critical escalation, the shift from resentment to planning. Through Catherine Magbanua, Charlie Adelson allegedly connected with Garcia and Rivera. The deal was straightforward but chilling. Kill Dan Markel in exchange for payment. Rivera, a member of the Latin Kings gang, would later testify about how the arrangement unfolded. He and Garcia were offered a large sum of money to travel to Tallahassee, stalk Dan, and end his life. The motive, prosecutors claimed, was clear: eliminate Dan, free Wendi from the custody battle, and allow Donna and her family to reclaim control. Money flowed through channels that were carefully concealed but not invisible. Payments disguised as checks, cash withdrawals, and suspicious transfers would later become key evidence. Escalating tension, the days before the murder. By the summer of 2014, the plan was in motion. Garcia and Rivera made the drive from South Florida to Tallahassee, surveilling Dan Markel's home, his routines, and his movements. Dan, meanwhile, was living his normal life. He had no idea strangers were watching him, no sense that his every move was being tracked. He taught his classes, spent time with his children, and maintained hope that the custody issues would eventually stabilize. Neighbors would later recall noticing unusual cars in the area, unfamiliar vehicles parked in spots near Dan's home. Some residents dismissed it as coincidence. Others, in retrospect, realized they may have witnessed the killers scoping out their target. While there's no direct evidence that Donna Adelson met the hitman herself, prosecutors argue her influence was undeniable. Donna's repeated complaints about Dan, her financial involvement in her children's lives, and her close communication with Charlie painted a picture of a woman who wasn't just passively observing. She was invested emotionally, financially, and, as prosecutors allege, criminally. On the eve of the murder, Garcia and Rivera were already in Tallahassee. They had followed Dan on errands, mapped out his schedule, and planned their strike. Back in South Florida, the Adelsons went about their lives. To friends, they were a close family. To investigators later, they were a network pulling strings. Donna, according to prosecutors, knew the pieces were aligning. She couldn't have known every detail, but the motive she carried, to free her daughter from Dan, was about to manifest in the most brutal way possible. Looking at these early warning signs, The bitter emails, the financial control, the inappropriate jokes about violence. Do you think outsiders should have spoken up sooner? Could friends or colleagues have done anything? Or are these signs always clearer only in hindsight? Share your thoughts in the comments below. By mid-July of 2014, the wheels were fully in motion. Dan Markel, a brilliant scholar and devoted father, was unknowingly living his final days. The hitmen were ready. The Adelsons' frustrations had escalated into action, and Tallahassee, a quiet college town, was about to become the stage for a crime that would shock the nation. It was a warm summer morning in Tallahassee. The sun broke through thin layers of cloud, casting pale light across tree-lined suburban streets. The air was humid, typical of Florida in July, thick enough to cling to the skin. Inside his modest home on Trescott Drive, Dan Markel prepared for his day. He had returned from the gym, showered, and dressed neatly in casual attire. He was a man who thrived on routine, from his morning workouts to the careful way he brewed his coffee. Dan had no idea that on this morning, his every move was being tracked. Two men, Sigfrido Garcia and Luis Rivera, sat in a silver Toyota Prius, idling within the neighborhood. They weren't neighbors, nor visiting friends. They were waiting, watching, stalking. For days, Garcia and Rivera had trailed Dan, learning his patterns. They knew where he lived when he left and where he taught. On this morning, they spotted their chance. As Dan pulled into his driveway around 11 a.m., the Prius followed closely. Neighbors would later recall the car creeping to the area, unfamiliar and suspicious. Inside the vehicle, adrenaline surged. Rivera would later testify that Garcia was tense, pacing emotionally in his seat, eager for the job to be done. Dan parked his car, stepped out, and moved toward the front door. He was likely thinking about his work or his children. There's no evidence he sensed danger in those final seconds. Then, in a chillingly deliberate act, Garcia exited the Prius, approached Dan, and shot him point-blank in the head. The quiet neighborhood erupted with a deafening crack of gunfire. Dan collapsed near his garage, gravely wounded. Neighbors rushed to call 911. Their voices panicked as they reported what they'd seen and heard. The Prius sped away, leaving behind only the echo of violence. The 911 call was frantic. A neighbor shouted, "A man's been shot. He's in the driveway. He's bleeding badly." Dispatchers sent police and EMTs racing to the scene. When first responders arrived, they found Dan still alive but barely conscious. Blood pooled beneath him, his breathing shallow and uneven. EMTs worked frantically, stabilizing him enough to transport him to Tallahassee Memorial Hospital. But the prognosis was grim. Doctors and nurses fought desperately to save Dan's life. Despite their efforts, the bullet wound was catastrophic. His parents, Phil and Ruth, rushed to Florida, praying for a miracle. Within hours, Dan Markel was pronounced dead. He was 41 years old. The ripple of grief extended far beyond the hospital walls. His colleagues at Florida State University, his students, his friends, and especially his two young sons, were left shattered. Back at Trescott Drive, crime scene investigators secured the area. Yellow tape cordoned off the driveway and garage. Detectives combed for shell casings, fingerprints, and any sign of forced entry. What they found was telling. The shell casings indicated a close-range, execution-style shooting. Neighbors reported the unfamiliar Prius circling before the crime. Security cameras in nearby areas captured glimpses of the silver car. It was clear this was no random act of violence. It was targeted, personal. Investigators retrieved surveillance footage from multiple sources. One camera, mounted outside a local business, showed the Prius tailing Dan's vehicle. Another captured the suspects driving into the neighborhood before the murder. Every piece of footage was carefully analyzed, enhancing the blurry outlines of the car and cross-referencing license plate records. Still, the evidence was circumstantial. The killers had planned well, leaving little behind. But investigators were relentless. News of the murder spread quickly across Tallahassee. The idea that a respected law professor, a father too, had been gunned down in his own driveway was unthinkable. At Florida State University, students wept. Colleagues struggled to comprehend the loss. Vigils were held, candles flickering against the humid night sky as friends shared stories of Dan's brilliance and kindness. But beneath the grief lay another undercurrent: suspicion. Those who knew about the bitter custody battle couldn't help but wonder, was this connected? Detective began interviewing neighbors, friends, and colleagues. Patterns emerged. Everyone knew about the contentious divorce. Many described the Adelson family's deep hostility toward Dan. Some recalled overhearing bitter comments, veiled threats, and constant talk of relocation. The theory began to take shape. This was no burglary gone wrong. It was a targeted hit. The silver Toyota Prius became the central lead. Investigators poured resources into tracking it, canvassing dealerships, rental companies, and traffic cameras. Eventually, they traced the vehicle to Miami, and connections to Catherine Magbanua surfaced. Magbanua's ties to Garcia and Rivera, and her relationship with Charlie Adelson, painted a damning picture. But at this stage, prosecutors still didn't have enough to indict the Adelsons. They needed more: wiretaps, testimonies, financial records. Meanwhile, Dan's family, particularly his parents, began pushing publicly for justice. They demanded answers, attending press conferences, and pleading with authorities not to let the case go cold. Their grief was raw. Dan's mother once said through tears, "My son deserved to live, to raise his children, to share his gifts with the world. Instead, he was stolen from us in the most cruel way imaginable." For them, the murder wasn't just about losing a son. It was about two little boys growing up without their father, robbed of bedtime stories, hugs, and guidance. Over time, the threads began to connect. Cell phone records placed Garcia and Rivera near the scene. Financial records suggested suspicious payments flowing through Magbanua. And most damning, wiretaps captured conversations between Charlie and Donna Adelson, joking about TVs and hitmen. But bringing down the Adelsons would require patience, persistence, and airtight evidence. If you were an investigator on this case, what would you focus on first? The forensic evidence at the crime scene, or the suspicious family dynamics pointing toward motive? Let me know in the comments. I'm curious how you'd approach this tangled web. By the end of 2014, investigators were convinced. The murder of Dan Markel wasn't random. It was a carefully orchestrated hit, fueled by resentment, custody battles, and family loyalty. But suspicion wasn't enough. To secure convictions, detectives had to untangle a conspiracy, from the hitmen in Miami to the wealthy Adelson family in South Florida. By 2016, 2 years after Dan Markel's murder, investigators finally had enough to move. On May 25, 2016, arrests were made. Sigfredo Garcia and Catherine Magbanua were taken into custody. Garcia was charged as a gunman, and Magbanua was accused of acting as a go-between, linking Charlie Adelson to the killers. Shortly after, Luis Rivera, already serving a lengthy prison sentence for unrelated crimes, struck a deal with prosecutors. He admitted his role in the murder-for-hire plot and agreed to testify. Rivera's testimony was explosive. He detailed how Garcia pulled the trigger, how Magbanua coordinated payments, and how the money traced back to the Adelson family. The dominoes were beginning to fall. Luis Rivera's account was chilling in its simplicity. He and Garcia had been promised $100,000 to kill Dan Markel. After the job, Rivera claimed he was paid only a fraction, with the rest funneled through Garcia and Magbanua. He described the drive from Miami to Tallahassee, the surveillance of Dan, the shooting, and the hurried return. His cooperation gave prosecutors what they needed: an inside view of conspiracy. The trial stretched over years, each one peeling back another layer of the truth. 2019, Sigfredo Garcia was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Catherine Magbanua's trial ended in a mistrial, but in 2022, she was retried and convicted of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and solicitation. She too received a life sentence. Each conviction brought prosecutors closer to the Adelson family. The most damning evidence against the Adelsons came in the form of wiretap conversations. In one conversation, Charlie Adelson joked his mother about buying Wendi a television to replace Dan, but clarified that a hitman might have been the better gift. Another recording captured Donna's frustration over the investigation, complaining that the family was being harassed and implying they knew more than they admitted. The casual tone of these conversations shocked jurors. They revealed not only knowledge of the crime, but chilling indifference to the gravity of taking a man's life. In 2023, Charlie Adelson finally stood trial. The courtroom was tense, packed with media, family, and curious onlookers. Prosecutors painted him as a linchpin, the son who acted on his mother's fury, using his girlfriend and her associates to carry out the hit. Defense attorneys argued otherwise, claiming Charlie was being scapegoated. But the evidence was overwhelming. Rivera's testimony, Magbanua's conviction, and the web of financial records linking the payments. In November 2023, the verdict came in, guilty on all counts. Charlie Adelson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Dan's family, it was a moment of long-awaited justice, but still incomplete. Just 1 week after Charlie's conviction, another bombshell dropped. On November 13, 2023, Donna Adelson, then in her 70s, was arrested at Miami International Airport. She was reportedly preparing to flee the country with her husband, Harvey, in an apparent attempt to escape prosecution. Prosecutors announced she was indicted on charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and solicitation in the killing of Dan Markel. Nearly a decade after the crime, the woman investigators believed had pushed hardest for Dan's death was finally facing justice. Donna Adelson's first court appearances were striking. Once known as a doting grandmother and respected member of her community, she now sat in an orange jumpsuit, shackled, listening as prosecutors laid out her alleged role in the murder of her former son-in-law. For Dan's parents, it was bittersweet. They had long suspected Donna's involvement, but seeing her indicted was still surreal. The aftermath of the Markel family. For nearly 10 years, the Markel family fought tirelessly for accountability. They attended hearings, spoke to media, and advocated for victims of violent crime. Dan's parents continued raising awareness about their grandchildren, whom they were largely estranged from due to the Adelsons' influence. Their fight wasn't only for justice in the courtroom, but also for access to the 2 boys who lost their father. Dan's legacy lived on in his scholarship, his published works, and the students he inspired. But for those closest to him, the loss remained immeasurable. The case drew national attention, not only because of its tragic details, but also because of the legal and moral questions it raised. How far will family loyalty go when fueled by anger and resentment? Can wealth and privilege shield people from justice, or will truth eventually prevail? What happens to children caught in the crossfire of such bitter disputes? These questions continue to haunt discussions about the case. Do you believe Donna Adelson will be convicted now that she's finally been indicted? Or will her defense manage to raise enough doubt about her involvement? Let me know your predictions in the comments. The murder of Dan Markel was not only a personal tragedy, but also a cautionary tale about the dangerous extremes of family conflict. A brilliant scholar's life was cut short not by random violence, but by an alleged conspiracy fueled by resentment, control, and the unwillingness to let go. For the Markel family, justice has been a long, painful journey. And with Donna Adelson now facing trial, the story is still unfolding. A stark reminder that the pursuit of truth can take years, but persistence matters. And that brings us to the end of this case, a story so disturbing it leaves you questioning how many others are suffering in silence. What are your thoughts on this case? Let me know in the comments. If this story shook you, there's more on the channel that dives into cases just as haunting. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and share this video. It helps keep these stories from being forgotten. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.